Many of us are here today began with Touch for Health and the triangle of health. We learned to balance our clients with techniques drawn from the structural, physical, emotional, psychological, mental, or biochemical nutritional sides of the triangle. And to help our clients avoid chronic degenerative conditions, we sometimes have to broaden our perspective. It is true that many health problems, such as obesity and diabetes, are due to deficiencies created by the ingestion of ultra-processed foods. Have you considered, however, that sometimes the deficiencies are because trace minerals are absent from the rocks that eroded to produce the local soils? Could the health issues stem from the presence of toxic elements within the local soils? Our presenter today has a PhD in geology from Victoria University in Wellington, New Zealand. When he was teaching environmental geology within the university system, one of the areas that fascinated him was the relatively new area of medical geology. It was the perfect marriage between his academic training in geology and his newfound interest in kinesiology. If you have not entertained this contribution to our health or lack of it, this would be a wonderful opportunity to open up a dialogue on the topic of geology and your health with Dr. Wayne Topping. Please welcome Wayne.
Thank you, Sylvia. Well, it's good to see you all online. The title today, Geology and Your Health, and what we're going to be looking at primarily mineral deficiencies in the soil and the impact they have on our health. I'm going to be looking at 4 major examples to illustrate the principle, and I pick nutrients that are critically important for our health. Now, I spent the first 27 years of my life in New Zealand, born just inland from New Plymouth here. And so every morning when I woke up, pretty much when it wasn't raining, which was quite a lot of the time, this was what I could see, a mountain, Mount Egmont. It's a dormant volcano, last erupted about 755 AD. And so I climbed at age 14. As I was climbing it, I would see various strata, layers of ash and stone rubble erupted out of the volcano. And I asked the obvious question, when did these eruptions occur? Now, no one could answer the question, so I was forced to do some research, started reading books about volcanoes. That got me interested in geology. Then when I decided to go to Victoria University in Wellington, New Zealand, my intention was to do a degree in forestry, because New Zealand has lots of natural forests, and I was interested in plants, so I thought that would be a great career to get into. However, as so happens, what happened, the first geology exam, I got 90%. Second person got 79%. That was out of a class of 150 people. So I thought, wow, I need to take this more seriously. So immediately I decided not to go and major in geology, in forestry, but to go into geology. So this is my academic background. I did a double major, geology and botany, because I loved plants, and so I wanted to do both. I did a Bachelor of Science degree in geology, got first class honors. That means I could go straight into a PhD program without doing masters. And I worked on the Tongariro Volcanic Center. So this is Ngarahoe, which is a volcano that's active quite a lot of the time. An older volcano here, Tongariro, Ruapehu, which incidentally is having lots of earthquakes right now. Big lake there, so it's caused a lot of disasters periodically. That's Ruapehu in eruption. And there's where Ruapehu is, in the middle of the North Island of New Zealand. Now first, let me introduce you to a different type of volcano. This is one called Krakatoa that erupted in Indonesia back in 1883. Now this was a huge eruption. Just to give you an idea of the magnitude, when it erupted, the sound was so intense, the Australian Navy put to sea because they thought they were being bombarded by the enemy. It was actually a volcano 4,000 miles away. That's how colossal the eruption was. And the tsunami waves that were generated 42 meters high, about 138 feet high, with the death of over 36,000 people. So a huge eruption. Now, that type of eruption produces pumice. So this is a piece of rock. It's actually like a froth, liquid magma that chilled very quickly to form a glassy froth. And it's light because it has a lot of air trapped within it. And so that was picked up after it traveled around the world for about a year. Now, that type of rock is very poor in nutrients. So it has very little magnesium and cobalt and things like that. So here's an example of volcano in New Zealand, and you see the white underneath here. That's the same type of eruption material that was erupted out of Krakatoa. Very poor in nutrients. The last eruption that occurred in 1886 was basaltic, like the Hawaiian Islands, a little bit richer in magnesium, iron, things like that. But this whole area, the central part of the North Island, has on the surface soils made from these pumice eruptions. And that's what it looks like in the valley. Some of the areas where I was doing my PhD, it might be 400 feet thickness of one eruption that occurred about 232 AD. So a huge eruption. That would have been about the largest volcanic eruption probably in over 5,000 years. This is Lake Taupo in New Zealand. And that volcano I was talking about, that volcanic eruption, would have come out of that particular lake. So now we're going to start looking at what the impact is on the soil. So we're looking first at a mineral called cobalt. Cobalt's critically important because the only use it has in the body is it's a central part of the vitamin B12 vitamin. And B12 is probably one of the most valuable of the B vitamins. Crucially important for the nervous system, for energy, for lots of different functions in the body. Now, in the central part of the North Island, and I knew this when I went to university, in the 1930s, in the central part of the North Island where you had soils from this broken down pumice, you had a lot of cattle and sheep being raised there, but they were losing weight, there was poor growth, they were wasting away, and a lot of them end up dying, particularly the lambs. A lot of neurological damage. So the research scientists and the veterinarians and that recognized this has to be a nutrient deficiency, but they didn't know what it was. And 5 years later, 1935, they finally realized it's a cobalt deficiency. And if you had lambs and calves being raised on the pumice, then they failed to thrive, and lots of them died. But if they moved them to another pasture that's on a different rock type, then they thrived. So what they did in 1939 was added superphosphate and cobalt. So they added the mineral that was missing from the soil into the fertilizer, and then the animals were happy, they thrived and did well. So that was my first introduction to a disease that was very common, but due to a nutrient deficiency. When I came to California to teach geology, I went to a lecture given by Richard Dury in 1976. And that so impressed me, I decided to take a basic class. So in 1976, I took a touch health class, and there's only one level in those days. And because it fascinated me and I got good results, I became an instructor in 1977. And I continued teaching geology in Oregon, then up in Western Washington University, just below Vancouver, Canada, in 1979-80. Now, I applied for that position out of over 200 people that applied for the same job because oil was down, mining was down, so you had a glut of geologists looking for essentially non-existent teaching positions. And I decided, well, it's time to change careers. So I went and trained as a biokinesiology instructor with John Barton. And that's when I started looking at geology from a different perspective. Now I started looking at geology from the perspective of the nutrient deficiencies and the impact they created for humans. So the pumice soils I mentioned were very deficient in lots of major nutrients. They were deficient in things like phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, sulfur, cobalt, selenium, all of which are vitally important for normal human health. So what the scientists did and the agricultural people is put superphosphate and different chemicals into the fertilizer to make up for the deficiencies that occurred in this otherwise very poor soil. Now,
Yes.
cobalt is very important for us in vitamin B12 because it's very difficult to get hold of it. If we want to get B12 as humans, the best source is going to be red meat. That's lamb and beef, for example. The reason for that is because the animals pick up the cobalt from the soil. Then you have gut bacteria living in the gut that take the cobalt and convert into vitamin B12. So the animals have that, and when we eat the red meat or the milk that's produced by those animals, then we pick up the B12 that we need. It's quite a complicated thing. We can maybe discuss it in questions, but that's a major source of B12 for us. But if you have animals living on a soil deficient in cobalt, that doesn't happen. They don't survive, and we don't get the benefit of the cobalt that we need. Now, it's called bush sickness in New Zealand. Western Australia is called wasting disease. Great Britain is called pining disease. Norway, ovine, white liver disease. These are all the same thing. It's a cobalt deficiency, but they're all given local names. Sometimes German names, Kenish names, etc. But all due to a lack of cobalt in the soil, and so it's not available to people. Now, what are the deficiency symptoms of B12? A lot of them in the neurology area. People can end up going blind. They can start losing the ability to walk smoothly, things like that. And that's what you observed in the animals, the lambs in particular. Now, it's also recognized in other animals. So here's an article I'll show you about a Nova Scotian moose. I noticed we had a couple people on board from Canada today. So Nova Scotia is way in the southeastern part, way over the east coast of Canada. And what they recognize is that the moose had major problems. So here's an article that says, Nova Scotia moose mystery, a moose sickness related to cobalt and vitamin B12 deficiency. A wasting, debilitating disease with uncertain etiology. That means we don't know what causes it. Affecting moose in eastern North America has been reported repeatedly ever since the 1910s. Despite the intensive studies during 1930s to 1960s, the cause of the sickness could not be established. So here's an article that was published in 2004 because now they finally have figured it out after many decades. Cobalt deficiency was found in about half of the cases, and the investigation was complemented by determining the vitamin B12 level, which proved nutritional cobalt/vitamin B12 deficiency. So they finally recognized after decades that the reason these moose were not thriving was because the soils they were feeding off were deficient in cobalt. Now, the same thing happens in humans because I live in England right now where we have cobalt deficiency and selenium and iodine and magnesium, everything I'm going to be talking about. Now, another interesting question that you might want to consider, because it takes a long time for medicine to finally catch up on the research here, but is some of the Alzheimer's actually due to vitamin B12 deficiency? Because when you look at B12 deficiency, the first major symptoms would be things like memory loss, behavioral changes, increased agitation. But those are the sort of symptoms you get when you start getting into dementia and Alzheimer's. And so you could think that your elderly parent actually had Alzheimer's when in fact they could have a major B12 deficiency. Now, how do we know that? It's just not speculation because there have been cases where these people that were thought to have Alzheimer's were given intramuscular vitamin B12 injection, then suddenly they come to life and wonder what they're doing in this rest home. So it was actually a B12, major B12 deficiency they were suffering, not Alzheimer's. What are the other symptoms of B12 deficiency? Weight loss, fatigue, tiredness, that's one of the major ones, weakness, constipation, poor balance, tingling or numbness in hands and feet, depression, sore mouth or tongue. Now, when I was doing research on B12 a few months ago, I looked at some of the studies in New Zealand where they looked at different ethnic groups. And so what they did is they looked at the Maoris and the Pacific Islanders as one group, New Zealand European, that means Europeans, New Zealanders, but coming primarily from Britain, Denmark, and other parts of Europe, East and Southeast Asian people, and also people from South Asia. Now, South Asians, primarily Indian, a few Pakistani. And what they found was that the South Asian ethnic group, these are the ones that had the lowest vitamin B12 levels. And that's understandable because they eat very little red meat. Now, if they drank the milk, then they should get the B12 from the milk. But in Indian cuisine, lots of times the milk is heated. And when you heat the milk, then the B12 becomes unavailable. So even though they might have a lot of milk in the diet, because it's heated, they still end up with a B12 deficiency. And the other studies I found similar results in Toronto and United Kingdom. And yet most people don't realize that if they're not careful, if they don't choose the right sort of foods, then they can end up with B12 deficiency. The reason is because B12 is only synthesized by certain bacteria, primarily in animals like cows and lambs and deer, that type of thing. And so if you look at the major sources, red meat, milk, eggs, fish, shellfish, it's almost completely absent from all plants. So if someone's trying to be vegetarian or vegan, then they could really run into problems unless they're very careful, because the best plant sources, primarily two, the dried purple and green lava seaweeds, the sort of nori that you use to wrap the sushi, that's very, very rich in B12. So if someone's vegan, that's probably what they should be doing, is making sure they have enough of that in their diet, or taking foods like nutritional yeast, where the B12 has been used as fortified, as being added into the yeast. Okay, that's enough on cobalt, which is linked with B12, which is quite a common deficiency. Now we're going to look at magnesium. I've changed the color because I'm just to keep it separate. I'm going to look at two epidemiological studies because this will be the best way to demonstrate the importance of magnesium. First, we're going to look at Serbia. And this is a study that was done where they looked at magnesium and calcium in drinking water in relation to cardiovascular mortality. That means deaths by way of heart disease or stroke in Serbia. And just to give you the geological background, you've got some areas of Serbia have a lot of magnesium. And that's because the rocks there are ultramafic, they're very basic, a lot of magnesium, lots of iron, so rich source of magnesium. And also you've got dolomites. Now dolomites are a little bit similar to limestone. Limestone is calcium carbonate, like chalk, for example. But when you have the dolomite, some of the calcium is being replaced by magnesium. So if you get groundwater in an area of dolomites, then you pick up appreciable magnesium in that water. So it's just not the calcium, it's calcium and magnesium. Now, when you have rocks and water that's very rich in calcium and or magnesium, those two described as being hard water. And so in this particular study, they were looking at 65 different areas in Serbia where there's hard water. That means water that contained a lot of calcium and magnesium. And they're looking at the heart disease rates in these particular areas. And they're interested in two things. What heart disease rate do you find where you have high calcium and low magnesium versus high magnesium, a lot higher magnesium than in the other area. And then what they found was where you have high calcium and not very much magnesium, then you have a lot of heart disease. When you have a lot more magnesium in the water, then the heart disease rate drops way off. Now, prior to just recently, most of the research indicated, most of the scientists believed it was calcium in the water that's protecting the heart. But this study and another one I'll mention are showing no, it's not that. It's actually the magnesium that's protecting the heart, not the calcium. The hardness of water alone with high calcium, low magnesium shows a positive correlation with results obtained indicate a negative relationship between heart disease and magnesium. So there's no relationship between low magnesium. When they looked at the hard water, there was no correlation with heart disease. What they found was when the magnesium level went up, then the heart disease rate dropped. When the magnesium level came down, heart disease rate went up. So now we'll look at another epidemiological study. First, people living in Finland. In Finland, for a long time, they'd recognized that they had very high death rate from heart disease and also strokes, so heart attacks and strokes. And when they looked at the diet, they found a lot of animal fat, a lot of salt, calcium, very poor in magnesium and potassium. Okay, the diet's not very good, but they had some major negative factors such as a lot of smoking and loss of alcohol. Anyway, so they said, well, it's not a surprise that these people are having strokes and heart attacks. But then they started looking at more critically at the calcium magnesium levels within the water within Finland. This is in the abstract. It said for each 1 milligram per liter increase in magnesium, then the heart disease rate risk dropped by 4.9%. So as the magnesium level goes up, then the heart disease rate goes down. Whereas if you have 1 unit increment in the calcium magnesium ratio, that means calcium level starts going up, then you get increased risk of 3.1% in terms of heart disease. So very clear, it said, but do not support the earlier hypothesis of a protective role of calcium. So they were saying, yes, it was believed that calcium was what protected us against heart disease, but this research, and this is verified by the research in Serbia, is saying it's actually magnesium that's protecting people against heart disease. Now back to the people from Finland. So they decided that it was the magnesium there. But an interesting thing happened because some of these Finnish people then immigrated to the United States. And a lot of them in particular went to a state called North Dakota. So again, youngish to middle-aged men, kept the diet pretty much the same. A lot of animal fat, salt, calcium, poor in magnesium, potassium. So the diet was pretty much the same that they had back in Finland. They didn't change that. They still kept smoking, still kept drinking alcohol. But an interesting thing happened. Suddenly, rather than having lots of heart attacks, lots of strokes, suddenly the heart attack rate and the stroke rate drops dramatically, and they're living a long time. And so the researchers mystified because the diet hadn't changed. But they did find there's abundant magnesium in their well water, and so the conclusion was that was what was protecting them against the heart disease. So the diet was terrible, the smoking and alcohol consumption were negative, but the magnesium was more than sufficient to protect them. Now, why was that? If we look here, we find this is North Dakota. And you notice this entire area here, more than half the state, is what's called Williston Basin. That's a geological basin. And within that particular basin, you have some prominent rock types that are rich in dolomite. Now, I already mentioned that limestone is calcium carbonate. When you start getting appreciable magnesium within it, calcium magnesium carbonate, that's called a dolomite. And it means that the water that's running through that particular rock is dissolving up calcium and magnesium, so you're getting appreciable amounts of magnesium into that water supply. So it's a good source of magnesium, and that's what was keeping these Finnish immigrants alive. Now, limestones, on the other hand, rich source of calcium, don't have very much magnesium. It's not heart protective. Now, just this morning, I thought, out of curiosity, I'd look at typical water from the Dolomite area in northern Italy. And here we have calcium level 25.2 milligrams per liter, magnesium 14.1. So that's a very high amount of magnesium relative to calcium. So whenever I go into a store in different countries, I look at bottled waters and I look for one that has as high amount of magnesium as I can, because it's the magnesium content of the water that's heart protective, not the calcium level. So you want one with as much magnesium as possible. Now, I said magnesium is vitally important, but it's underappreciated as a nutrient. And one of the reasons why is because about 1% of your magnesium is in the blood. So medically, if they look at the magnesium level in your blood, they don't really get a real assessment of how you're doing in terms of magnesium. And they could find out, but it would cost a whole lot more, so it's normally not done. So normally the way you find out there's a magnesium deficiency is just by looking at all symptoms, because it becomes pretty obvious if you know what the symptoms are. But magnesium underlies lots of our chronic diseased conditions. So if we have arthritis, asthma, atherosclerosis or heart disease, chronic fatigue syndrome, depression, diabetes, epilepsy, convulsions, heart disease, high blood pressure, kidney disease, migraine headaches, obesity, osteoporosis, syndrome X, type 2 diabetes, all of those can be due to magnesium deficiency. So magnesium deficiency is probably the major mineral deficiency that's underlying a lot of our chronic diseased conditions, and yet most people don't know it. Now let's go to selenium. And I'll start out with Qishan County in China. Qishan, at the time I first started reading about this decades ago, they found that 1 in every 1,300 children was dying of cardiomyopathy. Cardiomyopathy was when the heart was becoming enlarged, and it happens as people get older, but this was killing people 1 in every 1,300 by age 6, which was unheard of. So the World Health Organization went in to do an investigation, and they were mystified until one of the veterinarians actually looked at the autopsies and said, wow, we see this in animals. This is a white muscle disease. This is a selenium deficiency. So the veterinarian knew what it was straight away. And so what they did is they took thousands of these children, put them onto sodium selenite 3 times a week, and after a few months, no more deaths. So it's very clear that this was purely a nutrient deficiency. It was a lack of selenium in the soil, and that became known as Qishan disease. Now, major problem associated with it, an enlarged heart, which is what kills most of the people, but also higher rates of cancer, cardiovascular disease, high blood pressure, strokes, eczema, psoriasis, arthritis, cataracts, alcoholism, infections. So again, when you have cancer, heart disease, high blood pressure, strokes, you're talking about selenium deficiency can be associated with lots of our major health issues that end up killing people. Now, if we go to China, this is Qishan area, and that very light green, that's an area that's very, very impoverished in terms of selenium, very little in the soil. The brighter green, there's more selenium, and then as we're going upwards into the darker greens, it's becoming, this would be a regular amount of selenium. This would be very poor levels. Then if we look at what happened during COVID-19, here's a study, association between fatality rate of COVID-19 and selenium deficiency. And what they found in that particular area where Qishan disease was prevalent, you had a lot more people dying from the virus than in other parts of China. Now, to me, that's no surprise because we have selenium deficiency. You get a lot more virus mutation and the immune system is weaker and you're more likely to get wiped out with a virus. So places like Zaire in Africa, where you have AIDS and Ebola, those sort of areas are usually very deficient in selenium. And this is what we find. This was the area of Qishan disease, and this is where lots of deaths were occurring during COVID-19 because of, again, the selenium deficiency. Now, this research being done in other areas. This is a study from 2022 of the European Journal of Heart Failure. And what they were looking at was the selenium level within the diet, 5,973 Dutch residents aged 32 to 80. And what they found was the lower the amount of selenium, the greater the incidence of heart disease. Or the other way around, actually, if you have higher levels of selenium, less heart disease. So again, selenium being heart protective. Now that's where we have low selenium soils. This is where I came from, and Sylvia as well, selenium deficiency. Then I moved to the United States, spent 35 years, 30 of them up in this area. Again, selenium deficiency. So this is an area where there's a lot of selenium deficiency, and this is where you get more heart disease, more cancers in the local population. Now, just in case the Canadians are wondering what's going on, this is the red area. This is part of Canada where you have very scarce amounts of selenium. So the areas that are best protected are in the plains areas. And this is Europe. The darker the color, the more deficient Europe is in terms of selenium. So it looks like Ireland's a place to go, unless you don't like rain, in which case you might not want to go there. Now, what else does selenium cause? These are some of the conditions linked in with selenium: heart disease, Kinesiology disease, which I've already mentioned, but also known as these: Lou Gehrig's disease, multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's disease. Now, these are all neurotoxicity related conditions, and this is the link: mercury, because selenium is a natural chelator for mercury. So if you have adequate selenium in the soil and therefore in the diet, when you're consuming the selenium is a natural chelator. It latches onto mercury, takes it out of the body. But if you're exposed to a lot of mercury from your outgassing mercury from your amalgams, maybe you eat too much tuna, or maybe you've had too many vaccines and you've got too much mercury in the brain, if you don't have adequate selenium, then that mercury creates toxicity and you can end up with Parkinson's, multiple sclerosis, Lou Gehrig's, etc. But also you've got a number of cancers: stomach, esophageal, colon, rectal, prostate cancers can be linked with selenium deficiency, cataracts, liver cirrhosis, obesity, pancreatitis, and as I said, a lot more viral infections, because where you have selenium deficiency, the viruses can mutate and damage the heart and kill people. Now, the other thing to be aware of is that selenium is one of the major nutrients needed for the thyroid. So the thyroid has more selenium than any other organ in the body. It's needed for all the thyroid hormones, and it's needed to convert the T4, which is the inactive hormone, thyroid hormone, which has to be converted to the active form, T3. And so if you don't have adequate selenium, then you don't get as much conversion occurring. So you end up with essentially an apparent thyroid hormone deficiency and underactive thyroid. Also, one of the things that can block that transformation from T4 to T3 is mercury. And again, you need the selenium to chelate the mercury out of the body so it doesn't block that transformation. Now, what are some of the areas deficient in selenium? China, North Korea, Eastern Siberia, New Zealand, Zaire in Africa, etc. In the United States, in the areas where you have the lowest amount of selenium, and they find 3 times as much heart disease as in other areas. So yes, if you look at the geological record and look at this sort of research, it's very clear that selenium deficiency is related to viral problems, heart disease, cancers, and that. But again, most people don't know this because they don't take a deep dive into the geological aspects. Natural sources of selenium: all you need to do is take 2 Brazil nuts a day. That will give you adequate selenium. I eat a lot of brewer's yeast that's rich in selenium also, garlic, mushrooms, etc. Now, final mineral we'll look at is iodine. And this is really interesting because this was once, over 100 years ago, this was regarded as the miracle mineral. It could bring about huge changes within the body. Now, medically it's regarded as too dangerous if you get above a certain critical limit. I'll tell you why that is. Now, I'll go back to the United States first. In the United States, as a geologist, I was familiar with something called the goiter belt. In the Midwestern area of the United States, particularly the states up around the Great Lakes, Michigan, Ohio, for example, you had lots of goiter problems. So prior to 1924, there's a city called Akron, for example, Ohio, 56% of the girls in school would have a swollen base to the neck. And what that means is the thyroid is not picking up enough iodine through the diet, through the blood, so it responds by growing larger. As it grows larger, the base of the neck grows more prominent. I'll show you a photograph later on. So anyway, a real problem there, and that was called the goiter belt because it was so prevalent. Now, in Switzerland, they first made the correlation between the lack of iodine in the soil and these goiter problems and cretinism. So their response was to add iodine into the salt. Now, the Americans thought that was a good idea, and so they did some research and verified it. So this research, what they did is they looked at these kids, these girls in Akron, Ohio. They took 2,190 of them, gave them 9 milligrams a day of sodium iodide. So they had a nutritional source of iodine for 2.5 years, and the goiter rate dropped from 56% down to 0.2%, almost non-existent. So it's very clear that this goiter problem was clearly just a lack of iodine. And so in 1926, the American government wisely added iodine into the salt so that the Americans, through their salt supply, would be getting adequate iodine so they wouldn't end up with goiter problems. Now, this information is all for the World Health Organization for various publications. At the present time, it's regarded that iodine deficiency is probably the world's single greatest cause of preventable mental retardation. So if people no longer were iodine deficient, that would do more to turn around mental retardation, to improve people's mental health than anything else that could be done. And even though we've known for decades that iodine deficiency causes major health issues, it's still a significant problem in 129 different countries. And some countries getting worse, and I'll tell you why. Now, 1/3 of the world's population live in areas where there's iodine deficiency in the soil. In some cases, as I'll explain, you have adequate iodine in the soil, but you just can't pick it up. Now, currently it's believed about 72% of the world's population is affected by an iodine deficiency disorder, which means almost 3 out of every 4 persons on planet Earth is not getting adequate iodine, even though we've known about this problem for decades. And part of the reason is because governments more recently have made some what I consider foolish decisions. Back in 1977, the American government put out a study saying, well, we're concerned about how fat Americans are becoming. We know the solution. You're eating too much fat. You've got too much sugar in the diet, too much salt. So you need to reduce salt. You need to reduce sugar. You need to reduce fat. And so they put them on, got them onto carbohydrates. And you know the story. They've become bigger ever since. So that didn't solve the problem. But from that time onwards, salt has been given a guard rap, and people are told. Right now, in America, the recommended daily allowance is 150 micrograms. That's barely enough to prevent goiter problems. And now they say that if you have anything more than that, you're taking toxic levels, which is actually quite crazy. I'll tell you why in a moment. But let's explain what's happened. As a consequence of that decision, then iodine, which had been used to add into baked goods as an anti-caking factor, was taken out. Then in the 1980s, they put bromine in place of iodine. Now, bromine and iodine are in the same vertical column in the periodic table, so they behave very similarly in a chemical nature. The only thing is bromine is extremely toxic. No use in the body from my perspective, from what I understand. And we're getting a lot of bromine from medications, from water treatment systems, from cars, from furnishings inside houses. So a lot of people get that. So now we're getting a lot of people very toxic in terms of bromine, and they're deficient. So American iodine levels have decreased 50% between 1971 and 2000. Why? Because people have been told, don't eat the salt, which was a major source of iodine for most of them, and bromine's been put in to replace the iodine. Let me tell you why this is all foolishness. Because the Japanese are some of the healthiest people in the world, and their iodine intake is about 13.8 milligrams, not micrograms, milligrams, which is almost 100 times as much as what the Americans recommend. 100 times as much. And they're not dropping dead of any condition. In fact, they have very low levels of breast cancer, prostate cancers, things like that. Until they moved to America, as they started adopting the American diet, then they started picking up breast cancer and prostate cancers. Now, over 100 years ago, levels of iodine that was suitable for human consumption were about 100 to 400 times what they now regard as safe, and was regarded as the universal medicine then. So how on earth did this happen? Well, it so happens, 1948, you had two researchers, Wolf and Chekhov, and they published research claiming that if you had iodine at levels of 0.2 milligrams per liter, it created hypothyroid or underactive thyroid conditions in rats and goiter problems. Now, there's actually no evidence that these rats became hypothyroid, and other researchers tried to duplicate the results, and no one's been able to duplicate the results. So it looked as though it was quite foolish research. It was unfounded, but the medical profession took that knowledge, got scared, and then said that anything above 150 micrograms per liter is dangerous, and that's where we stand in America right now. So look at what's happening. Netherlands, the country's soil and water sources are low in iodine. There's not very much iodine in the Dutch food supply, and they've been actively reducing the amount of salt, believing that salt is bad for you. It is, but we need to be taking natural sea salt rather than the commercial salt. So they've been reducing the amount of salt, and guess what they've been finding? That more and more people are becoming iodine deficient. So now what they've done is reversed course. They've started putting the iodine back into the bread, iodine back into the table salt, and because they realized they were going in the wrong direction. New Zealand, the same thing. This is what goiter looks like. Here's the thyroid, and if the thyroid is not getting enough iodine, it grows larger, and this is characteristic of areas where there's insufficient iodine in the ground. And you also get cretinism if there's not enough iodine in the first year of life, stunted growth, a lot of brain damage, mental retardation, etc. These are the areas that are deficient in iodine, and that's where I came from, New Zealand. That's where I lived for 30 years. So I was in areas that were deficient iodine. So I had to obviously supplement, add foods into my diet to make sure I got enough iodine. Now, the areas where you get most iodine deficiency would be the high mountainous areas such as Swiss Alps, Andes, and Himalayas, because the high precipitation, the rain and snow just wash it out of the soil. And the rain shadow areas, if you get the storm clouds coming in, dropping the rain on one side of the mountain, then on the other side of the mountain, the air is relatively dry and you don't get iodine dropping out. And so in the rain shadow areas and in the central continental regions, you end up with iodine deficiency. Because it used to be thought that, and I once believed, based on what I read, was that it was the iodine content of the soil that dictated how much iodine there was in plants and how much you picked up. But now it's recognized that no, most of the iodine is coming from the atmosphere, picked up from the ocean, and dropped out over the land. Now, some of that iodine then gets tightly absorbed in with the various components within the soil. So you can have lots of iodine in the soil, but it's just not being picked up. So if you look at organic rich shale as a rock type, they have lots of iodine, but it's not available to the plants. And another interesting thing is areas where you have lots of limestone, such as County Tipperary in Ireland, Northern Yorkshire, quite close to me, in England. Areas like this where you get the limestone, then the iodine is bound up. It's there in the soil, but it's not as available to the plants. So it's the plants might as well be growing in an area where there's a lack of iodine because it doesn't get to the plant and to humans. Now, what happens when the plants get exposed to the iodine? This is cross-section of the leaf of a plant. Here's the cuticle on the upper surface of the leaf and the lower surface, and this is a stoma. So during the sunlight hours, the stoma open up and iodine in the air can be taken into the plant. Then at night it closes up again. And so the iodine is within the plant. It's built into the structure of the plant. We eat the plant and we benefit from the iodine. So that's the latest thinking as to how we get the iodine. It's from the plants, which means if you're close to the ocean, then vegetables will have a lot of iodine. If you have a lot of seafood, a lot of seaweeds in the diet, you're getting a lot of iodine. You can have a lot of it in drinking waters. As long as they're using iodine as an antiseptic in the cattle industry, then you picked up the iodine in the milk, etc. So most people were getting enough iodine, but when you get areas away from the coast, and particularly areas of limestone, it becomes a problem. So this is why we need education, because in England, where I live now, 2/3 of the soils are deficient in magnesium. Cobalt and selenium deficiency, widespread. Iron deficiency, common. And if people don't know that and deliberately make sure that those nutrients are in their diet, then they're going to run into problems. So just to end with a couple of things, here's The Guardian, which is a newspaper in England here, 21st December 2023. It says, surge in number of people in the hospital with nutrient deficiencies, National Health Service figures show. So the number of people with nutrient deficiencies have tripled within the last 10 years. So people very deficient in iron, B vitamins, things like that. And see, I'm running short of time. I'll just jump straight to this article. This shows an extreme. This is Mail Online, published when COVID was just starting to hit this area, March of 2020. Here's a boy, 17-year-old, goes blind because of a vitamin deficiency. And look what his diet was, caused by eating years of eating only French fries, Pringles, white bread, and sausage. Now, he was 17 years old, and he wasn't smart enough to recognize that diet does not support life. So over a period of 3 years, he lost his eyesight. And medically, they didn't know what was going on. He was studying IT at college, but had to drop out. So at age 14, he started becoming tired. He had anemia, which should have told him his red blood B5 deficiency. He was injected with vitamin injections, told to eat meat, fruit, and vegetables, which he didn't. He hadn't eaten a single vegetable or fruit in more than 10 years. And it said that when his eyesight started failing, then the medics were puzzled. They carried out a number of tests on him. He had normal weight. He was not taking medication, so they had no idea what it was. Then 2 years, they finally checked out when he was starting to become blind, and they found out he had B12 deficiency, low copper, low selenium levels. That was giving him nutritional optic neuropathy, and by then he was permanently blind at age 17. That's an example of what's going on in England because of ignorance, because people don't realize that basic nutrients have to come from the food supply. And if the food is grown on soils that are depleted, you have to make sure you compensate in one way or another. Okay, let's end it there because we've run out of time.
Wayne, thank you so much. Oh, that covered a lot. It was interesting that when you first spoke about cobalt, I was remembering on the farm that in breeding Black Aberdeen Angus cattle, you could always tell when there was cobalt deficiency because their coat went from a shiny black to big patches of golden brown and red in the coat. And so to give them more minerals that they needed, and within a few weeks, their coat would change again back, and it was always a cobalt deficiency.
Yeah.
And so when you see the deficiencies happening in animals, and they actually have access to the raw materials more than what we do in our style of eating, you can certainly see where the deficiencies happen.
Yeah, I often think, Sylvia, that if people have health issues, instead of going to a medical doctor, what they should do is put a collar around their neck and have their neighbor take them to the veterinarian.
Actually, in some cases, you're right. There may be some people, Wayne, online that don't know. Under magnesium, you had a point there that was syndrome X. Can you explain what comes under that?
I think they're just talking about metabolic syndrome because what's happened, it's not a disease, but as people are eating too much ultra-processed food, there's a number of things happen. The waistline expands, the blood pressure starts going up, the triglyceride levels start going up, low-density lipoproteins go up, high-density lipoproteins drop. There's a whole combination of things that tell a nutrition-oriented doctor that if you don't make major changes in your lifestyle, you're headed for pre-diabetes, diabetes, then into heart disease, things like that. So metabolic syndrome is I think it's reasonably well recognized now as a precursor to diabetes, heart disease.
Wow.
Yeah.
Deborah says that one of my clients was a breast surgeon who was surprised she tested for iodine need and then realized all of her breast cancer patients were also iodine deficient.
When a person is pregnant, the breast has a higher need for iodine than even the thyroid does. And most people don't know that. So in the United States, I talked about the goiter belt. That's also the area where you have most breast cancer in America. That's where you have insufficient iodine. So, and one of the other things I didn't mention is when you get iodine levels about 100 times higher than what the Americans recommend, iodine actually encourages cancer cells to self-destruct. And so iodine's been used to kill cancer cells at high levels, but at the low levels that they have in America, that doesn't happen. And also they recognize that people that have the iodine deficiency are more likely to get breast cancer, they're more likely to get fibrocystic breast disease and things like that. So iodine should be regarded as a major nutrient for the, not only for the thyroid, but also for the endocrine system, particularly the reproductive system. Now, a lot of people don't know this, but if you look at the Touch for Health book, we had iodine was a nutrient for teres minor, also for the anterior neck flexors, but also for piriformis. Now, most Touch for Health people don't know that. And I think it was added in by John Thie, because John Thie ended up with cancer. His father was an expert in iodine and put out iodine supplements. So obviously he became very knowledgeable about that. So iodine is very protective of breast health, but also prostate health as well.
Thank you. So Rashida has asked Wayne, are there any ways of testing all minerals?
Yes, I mean, for example, when I work with someone, as I'm checking out the muscles, see which one's out of balance, I'm aware of what nutrients they are. So if I start finding, for example, that people have anterior serratus, the coracobrachialis, the middle trapezius, lower trapezius, subscapularis, sartorius, gracilis, I immediately think, it's a vitamin C deficiency, because they all need vitamin C. So I'm keeping that in the back of my mind as I'm balancing people, what the nutrients are. And so if I'm looking for, what I've been doing is research over the last few years to find the first muscles that go out of balance when people become deficient in certain nutrients. So in Touch for Health, for example, if I asked Touch for Health people, which muscles would you check if you suspected there might be a magnesium deficiency? We don't know because it's not part of Touch for Health. But I found there's a tendon called soleus medial tendon. It's just in behind the knee. You might not be able to see my knee there. Yeah, you can. But just in here, this is soleus medial tendon. When that goes out, when that becomes quite painful and goes out of balance, that to me is one of the first evidences in the body that the person becomes deficient in magnesium. And when that's out of balance, people become allergic to pollens, and they have a tendency towards asthma. And so there's a lot of research showing that asthma can sometimes be a magnesium deficiency. So the bronchial tubes become overly contracted, that type of thing. So that's what I've been doing, is looking at which particular muscles are related to B12, which ones relate to zinc, which ones relate to chromium, which ones relate to selenium, iodine, that type of thing. That's an ongoing project. I don't have it finished by any means. Now, in the nutritional testing class I teach, there are ways in which we can identify for any one particular item, is the body deficient in it or not? But I can't really teach that online.
Wayne, in the 1980s, when I was working a lot with John Barton's work, one of the things that really impressed me was that on so many of the points of the body, the muscles and the systems in the body, he had specific vitamins and minerals, which were very specific and most helpful to me working with clients. Have you included that in your wellness programs?
Yes, yes. So right now I'm working on two particular new workshops, one on sleep disorders and one on the immune system. Now, when you look at the immune system, one of the major organs is the thymus. Now, the thymus, most people don't realize, is actually larger than the heart at the time the baby's born. And because the heart's only about the size of a walnut, the thymus is larger. Thymus is functioning well until puberty, then starts getting smaller. And most people don't think it's really of much use beyond that. Yes, it is, but it's going atrophying because it doesn't have enough nutrition. They've done some research where they've supplemented with zinc, and they find they can start regrowing the thymus, so it gets larger again. And zinc is the major nutrient needed for the thymus. So teaching John Barton's work, I'd be looking at thymus reflexes, and if that's out of balance, I'd be holding up the zinc and seeing if zinc is one of the major nutrients to turn it around, because the thymus is one of the first organs that's going to need zinc. And for men, prostate is another one.
Excellent. Wayne, we have actually done our time. Thank you so much. And you've shared lots with us. And thank you for the gorgeous pictures at the beginning of the volcanoes and the mountains and Mount Taranaki. And
I thought you'd enjoy New Zealand.
Absolutely. I had a little trip home. It was very good. Thank you so much for your research, for your time, and for your ability to bring it all together. For Meet the Authors, we have a line, and our philosophy is this: unity with diversity. And that's one of the things that Wayne brought to us today, was diversity. How much further can we look? How well can we not only look after ourselves, but the people who come to us? And sometimes what seems to be the obvious problem is just the symptom. What underlies that is what we're all here to learn about. The deficiencies perhaps not even in our meal that we're eating today. Maybe what we had last week, last month, last year, that which we've had over a period of time, until the body is so deficient that it forgets how to be well again. One of the things that I wish for all of us is that we know just absolute happiness, joy, and wellness in our lives. Thank you all for being here. Good days. May you know love and wellness.